The Secret War for Africa's Gold, How Private Armies Fund Global Conflict. The convoy hit the bend at Ndassima when the gunfire started. Dust, muzzle flashes, men scattering between rusted crushers and fresh concrete. A contractor yelled to kill the engine. Another dragged a bleeding miner behind a diesel tank. 30 seconds later, the radio crackled one word: gold. Here's the part most people miss. That firefight wasn't about ideology. It was a checkpoint dispute inside a gold mine run by companies nobody votes for and guarded by men who don't wear national flags. To understand why private armies are now gatekeepers of Africa's wealth, we need to rewind to when war started paying in ore. The rewind, how the security for resources model took root. It begins in the 1990s, when African states were broke, wars were endless, and aid came with conditions, but no helicopters. Angola's government was losing oil terminals and diamond towns to UNITA. They hired a small South African firm, Executive Outcomes. Fewer than 600 contractors at peak, training local units, flying aging gunships, moving fast where a 100,000 strong army couldn't. Within months, Soyo and Kafunfo were back under government control. By the end of 1994, UNITA had lost major cities and its Wambo stronghold, and the Lusaka Protocol followed. The bill, tens of millions, was a fraction of what the UN later spent. 2 years later, Sierra Leone was collapsing. The RUF was at the gates of Freetown, the diamond fields funding their advance. About 200 to 300 Executive Outcomes personnel landed, linked up with the Countermeasures, and did what the National Army hadn't: lifted the siege in 10 days, pushed the rebels over 100 kilometers inland, and cleared Kono district in 2 days so miners could work and elections could happen. Losses were minimal for EO. The results were blunt. Then came the pressure. Mercenaries, legitimacy, sovereignty. Western capitals hated the precedent. Contracts ended. Violence surged back. This is where the model quietly shifts. Governments had seen a small, skilled force change reality at speed. Companies saw that mines, oil fields, and airstrips could underwrite war. Deals started to look different. Payments weren't only in cash. They could be in access, concessions, offtake, future royalties. Security for resources wasn't born with Wagner. It was incubated when Executive Outcomes proved the speed premium. Fast forward to the late 2010s. Russia is sanctioned after 2014, then heavily after 2022. It needs hard currency outside formal systems. Africa has gold, movable, launderable, and if you have muscle, controllable. Partnerships offer something many juntas and fragile governments want more than lectures: survival. Training, bodyguards, close air support, propaganda. In exchange, permits, sites, a free hand in remote areas, and political cover. Central African Republic becomes the blueprint. Since 2017, Russian mercenaries back President Touadéra. They take on rebels, secure the capital, and then move out along roads that lead to mines. Ndassima, once artisanal tunnels and shacks, gets industrialized. Processing areas expand between 2022 and 2023. New crushers arrive. A private airstrip appears near another site. The ownership maze thickens. Midas Resources, Lobe Invest, heavy industrial SAL, shells with straw owners and Russian nationals tied in. The state gets security, the network gets the ore. The human cost sits in the tailings. Artisanal miners, men who fed families from riverbeds and shafts, are displaced at gunpoint or folded into low-pay shifts behind wire. Reports stack up of killings during security operations. Over 900 civilians dead in operations linked to Russian mercenaries across CAR since 2020, according to rights groups. Meanwhile, gold flows out. Not through Banghi's customs windows, but through luggage, small planes, and middlemen to the UAE, where unregulated intake makes African gold look clean overnight. Analysts estimated African gold tied to Kremlin-linked networks generated over $2.5 billion since the Ukraine war escalated, a sanctions workaround smelted into bars. While that was happening in CAR, similar bargains took shape across the Sahel. In Mali, after coups and a break with France, Russian-linked contractors arrived with training teams and deniable units. Mining concessions followed in gold regions near major hubs such as Lulo and Fekola. Deals often bypassed competitive tenders, bundled with military agreements. In Sudan, the political marketplace was even more open. Meroe gold, linked into Wagner's business web, extracted and smuggled at scale, working within a fractured state and overlapping militia influence. What nobody knew at the time, at least outside the rooms where it was planned, was how much the gold would matter once the financial noose tightened. Dollars are traceable. Bullion isn't, not in the same way. A few courier flights to Dubai, a refinery with loose questions, and the revenue disappears into accounts that buy ammunition, fuel, and influence. Meanwhile, across town, in Johannesburg's shadow, another economy grew out of absence rather than alliances. South Africa's formal gold sector shrank, leaving thousands of abandoned shafts. Zamas descended. Criminal syndicates supplied explosives, weapons, and buyers. 30,000 illegal miners by some estimates, 6,000 disused mines in play, and whole neighborhoods entangled in an underground war. It wasn't a PMC story, but it rhymed. When the state retreats, someone else controls the resource, violence enforces the contract, and gold settles the bill. Rwanda added a twist. In Car, Rwandan forces deployed to protect the government, and in parallel, some Rwanda-linked interests sought access to mining. Competing security patrons, competing concessions. The mine gate became a foreign policy instrument. Sanctions arrived. The US Treasury blacklisted Wagner-linked companies in Car. Names on lists, assets frozen, warnings to traders. But the ground reality didn't shift overnight. Shells rebranded. Wagner morphed into an Africa Corps label. Local straw holders shuffled papers. The airfield stayed busy. The processing plants kept humming. Here's the hinge. Once a government survival is bundled with a concession, accountability breaks. If the men with guns secure the road to the refinery, who audits the weighbridge? If the same network that trains the Presidential Guard also owns the processing plant, who argues when artisanal miners are told to leave? The bargain trades sovereignty in monthly installments. It's subtle at first, permits extended, export quotas waived, then structural. Budgets depend on off-book gold advances. The model persists because every side thinks it wins. Leaders stay in power. Contractors get assets that appreciate. The gold moves in quiet. Only the communities at the pit edge see the true cost. And the fight at Ndassima's bend. That was two layers of the same system colliding over a shipment that couldn't be late. Executive outcomes, blueprint, and the resource bargain. To see how the bargain was built, you have to watch executive outcomes work a battlefield into a balance sheet. EO didn't sell ideology. They sold outcomes with a clock on them. Angola, 1993. The government needed Soyo's oil terminal and Kafunfo's diamond fields back, because those weren't just map points, they were revenue taps. EO arrived lean, rotary-wing gunships, mortars, small teams of veteran instructors, and moved quicker than a ministry could draft a memo. They trained Angolan units to hold what they took, but EO choreographed the tempo. Towns fell in days, not seasons. When Huambo cracked, the message was blunt. Revenue centers could be reclaimed if you hired speed. The invoice line was just as blunt. Around $35 million for Angola, according to later reporting. In Sierra Leone, roughly $31 million a year. Set that against the hundreds of millions, even billions, burned by international missions that arrived later and moved slower. That cost comparison wasn't a moral defense, it was a sales deck. Presidents and ministers saw a formula. Small, skilled force plus air support equals control of the places that pay the budget. But here's the detail that would echo for decades. Inside those contracts lived side deals, security over resource corridors, site protection, sometimes introductions to firms with an appetite for concessions. EO's leadership denies they were paid in diamonds, and there's no verified ledger saying otherwise. What mattered was the logic EO demonstrated. Secure the mine, the port, the pipeline, and the war staffs. That flips the incentive. Security stops being a public good. It becomes a bolt-on to extraction. Micro story from Sierra Leone still haunts the ministries that watched it unfold. A finance official, kept awake by the Treasury's emptiness, ate breakfast when a call came through. Kono district was open, trucks could roll. He dropped his spoon, told his driver to warm the car, and called the central bank on the way. Within a week, customs revenue ticked up. The cabinet meeting that Friday ended with one sentence: "Find the money for EO." The proof wasn't a white paper, it was trucks moving. Meanwhile, in Luanda, oil executives took meetings under guard. EO teams secured perimeters so derricks could keep pumping, and in exchange, the state kept the contract alive. Everyone could read the math. If you can monetize the ground you stand on, you can pay the men who help you hold it. That seed, security anchored to assets, was the blueprint others would copy and strip of its guardrails. The resource bargain grew out of a practical problem. Many African treasuries lacked cash, and donors distrusted presidents who hired mercenaries. So payments bent around that bottleneck. Concessions could be issued now. Royalties would flow later. Equity stakes could sit quietly in a nominee's name. When contracts ran into diplomatic pushback, the ledger moved further into the dark. A company would protect a diamond field. A friendly intermediary would win an exploration license. A refiner offshore would handle the product. Everybody could tell themselves it was legal enough. This was the moment everything changed in the pitch. Before EO, the ask sounded like "pay us to fight." After EO, the offer sounded like "let us make your problem an asset." Protect the mine, and the mine pays for protection. Hold the road, and the road brings tax. It was elegant and corrosive at once, because once the mine became the budget, everything around it bent to that priority. There was one problem no one solved. What happens when artisans are the budget before the bulldozers arrive? In both Angola and Sierra Leone, clearing rebels meant clearing informal diggers too, sometimes for safety, often for order. It set a habit. If small-scale miners complicated a security perimeter, they were moved. In later years, when new actors copied the model, that habit hardened into policy enforced by men with rifles and lists. International pressure knocked EO out. The IMF and UN leaned on governments to cut ties, arguing sovereignty and legal norms. But the demonstration effect survived the shutdown. Former contractors scattered into new firms. Politicians who once signed EO's checks now called different companies with similar CVs. The market for force had seen its first clear case study, and investors noticed. Deals started to read like hybrids: a mining junior with a security annex, a logistics firm with stabilization in the fine print, a presidency with a private guard embedded and paid by a partner extracting down the road. Here's where EO's legacy gets complicated. In the narrow terms of war, they shortened killing. In the longer arc of governance, they normalized a shortcut, outsourced the monopoly on force where it touches money. That doesn't just win back towns, it rewires who the state serves first. The town at the pit edge feels it immediately. The weighbridge becomes a checkpoint. The checkpoint becomes the law, and the law answers the ledger before it answers the flag. The Wagner turn, from advisors to a parallel state. Get this, when the first Russians landed in Bangui in 2017, the pitch sounded familiar. Advisors, trainers, a few bodyguards, some kit for the presidential guard. No tanks rolling down the boulevard, no invasion optics. On paper, it was a training mission approved by a government that needed muscle and didn't want more lectures. But the mission brief wasn't the whole story. The real plan lived on the roads out of the capital, the ones that run toward places where rock turns into money. To understand why, we need to look at the political math. Touadéra's presidency was under pressure, rebel coalitions ringed the city, and every donor meeting came with conditions. Wagner offered a turnkey package: security operations, intelligence support, information campaigns, and personal protection for the president, bundled with something else: the capacity to hold terrain that mattered economically. Meanwhile, something else was happening up north and east. Survey teams with security escorts walked ground that artisanal miners had worked for years. Maps turned into permits, and permits turned into companies with names nobody had heard the week before. This was the moment everything changed on the timeline. The advisors didn't just teach tactics inside a barracks, they built a parallel logistics chain. Airlifts brought in equipment. Convoys moved with their own rules. Checkpoints answered to radios outside the state's command net. The bureaucracy adapted to the new gravity. When a company like Lobe Invest appeared on a concession, it wasn't random. It slotted into a network of shells and affiliates, Midas Resources, heavy industrial SAL, fronted by straw owners or Russian nationals with clean paperwork. Licenses were long, obligations opaque, and enforcement conveniently thin. At Ndassima, you could watch the parallel state pour itself into the ground. Processing pads expanded between 2022 and 2023. New crushers appeared behind fresh wire. A dirt strip near another site began to look like a private airfield. Unknown to villagers downstream, contracts offsite set the revenue splits before the first ounce left the mill. The guards at the gate weren't wearing national insignia. Their orders came from men whose authority depended on what the plant produced. If a group of artisanal miners wandered too close, security operations followed. Reports from rights monitors began to rhyme. Arrests, disappearances, bodies found near dig sites after clashes. By 2020 onward, more than 900 civilians were reported killed in operations linked to Russian mercenaries across Kar. That statistic wasn't a headline inside the concession. It was a perimeter rule. Meanwhile, the capital felt safer. The palace was secure. Roadblocks inside Bangui were quieter. The presidency could point to stability and say the partnership worked. That's the double bind. In exchange for visible calm in the city, the countryside absorbed the cost. The mine gate became policy. Ministries that once issued export licenses now learned to look the other way when plain manifests didn't match production figures. When a shipment left for the UAE, the paperwork often showed a different origin story by the time it hit a refiner's intake desk. Gold is patient. It changes hands until questions get tired. What nobody knew outside the network was how neatly this fed Russia's sanctions puzzle after 2022. Dollars leave fingerprints. Bullion doesn't talk. A bar that starts life in Kar can pass through traders in Khartoum or Bamako, catch a flight to Dubai, and step into the global bloodstream with a new shirt on. Analysts tracking flows estimated more than $2.5 billion raised through Africa-linked gold, smuggled via Kremlin-connected channels since the Ukraine war escalated. In the field, that number felt like diesel drums filled, salaries paid, and new contracts inked. The model traveled. In Mali, after the coups and the split with France, Russian-linked units took up positions, while companies with Russian capital appeared near gold belts such as Lulo and Fekola. Deals bypassed tenders, wrapped in security agreements. In Sudan, Meroe gold operated inside a war economy where generals and militias traded protection for access. The pattern held: protect the corridor, hold the pit, move the metal off book. Sanctions landed like stones in a river. The US Treasury designated entities tied to Wagner in Kar. Some banks froze transfers. A few traders backed away. But on the ground, Logos changed faster than habits. Wagner rebranded into an Africa Corps veneer. Local nominees rotated on official documents. The same operators showed up at the same gates. A refinery doesn't care what you used to call your company. It cares that a courier shows up with product and a plausible story. Here, that's where the parallel state became visible even to people who didn't want to see it. If the foreign guards decide who enters a district, the mayor's office is a courtesy. If a private airstrip dictates when a town wakes up to the thump of rotors, the Civil Aviation Authority reads about it later. If a communications team floods local radio with stories about rebels and traitors, while rivals are quietly targeted, the information space becomes part of the concession. It's not just security for resources anymore. It's governance for royalties, and the franchise sits outside the Constitution. A micro-story puts a face on it. A schoolteacher in Bambari tried to reopen classes after months of fighting. She walked past a new checkpoint that wasn't there the year before. The guard didn't check her ID. He asked where her brother worked. When she said, "The mine," the guard waved her through with a smile. 2 days later, her brother's team was told their shift was moving nights for security reasons. The rhythm of the town changed to match the mill's schedule. By then, even allies noticed the crowd at the trough. Rwanda's contingent, deployed to support Carr's government, watched Rwanda-linked interests explore opportunities of their own. Competing patrons, overlapping concessions, and a state too relieved to pick a fight with either. That's the quiet risk inside the Wagner turn. It starts as help. It settles as a habit. And then it hardens into a system that outlasts the men who signed the first invitation. Ndassima, the mine that rewired a country. The first time a government minister visited Ndassima after the upgrade, he didn't go to the pit. He went to the control room. 2 monitors, a wall map with colored pins, a whiteboard listing shifts and convoy times. A Russian-speaking supervisor tapped the schedule with a capped marker and said, "Production must not stop." The minister nodded, smiled for a photo, and left with a gift bag that smelled like diesel. The pit didn't need speeches. It needed trucks to keep moving. To understand how a mine rewires a country, start with the road. Before the expansion, that laterite ribbon was a rumor during rainy season. After it, graders arrived. Drainage ditches appeared. A checkpoint went up where the road kinked past a village well. The men there weren't gendarmes. Their radios didn't crackle with the state's call signs. They logged license plates into a notebook, stamped with a company logo most locals couldn't pronounce. If your cargo matched their list, the barrier lifted. If it didn't, your day ended in shade, waiting for a phone call from someone with a key. Meanwhile, something else was happening uphill. Artisanal miners had once spider-webbed the place with hand-cut shafts. Families made a living in narrow margins, gold dust traded for rice, batteries, school notebooks. When the concession firmed up, those shafts turned into liabilities. Notices appeared on trees. Meetings were called. Warnings were issued. The area was now industrial. Some diggers took low-paid jobs as laborers inside the fence. Others were pushed off with operations that looked like policing until gunfire started. Witnesses told rights groups about bodies left near the tailings. Those reports stacked up, town by town, until they felt like a pattern more than incidents. Inside the wire, you could trace the new muscle in poured concrete. Between early 2022 and 2023, the processing pad sprawled. New crushers, fresh paint, imported parts, lined up like cattle at a trough. A conveyor rattled stones toward a mill house that hummed day and night. A water cannon arced slurry into settling ponds cut into the earth like rectangles of dull mercury. Near a different site, a dirt strip flattened into something straighter, longer. Local pilots started whispering about private flights that didn't appear on anyone's public schedule. People stopped asking who owned the plane. They asked who controlled the fuel. The names behind the gates changed masks, but not faces. Lobe Invest on one permit, Midas Resources on another. Heavy Industrial SAL on a list no journalist could get in full. Straw owners took the front seats on paper. Russian nationals sat where the decisions actually landed. When sanctions hit, emails bounced to new domains. The stamp on a letterhead shifted, the phone number didn't. Banghi's ministries learned to route requests through liaisons who spoke fluent euphemism. Export paperwork moved fast for some shipments and not at all for others. The ledger that mattered wasn't in a government building. It lived on spreadsheets far from public audits. A micro-story marks the pivot point. A district chief, proud of his stamp and tricolour sash, walked to the mine gate to negotiate a school repair fund the company had promised. The guard glanced at his sash and waved him to a bench. He waited an hour before a junior manager handed him a sealed envelope. Inside, 2 pages in French detailing a community engagement calendar that pushed the school to next year. He signed the receipt because refusing didn't open the gate. Back home, he told his council the mine had confirmed support. Everyone knew what that meant. The calendar, not the council, ran the town. Meanwhile, the capital celebrated stability. Markets reopened. Roadblocks thinned. Donor meetings, once icy, softened when delegates saw fewer burned cars. But the calm rode on a bargain. The presidency got fighters, trainers, a propaganda arm that blended rumor with reassurance. The network around the mine got predictability, escorted convoys, a compliant perimeter, a free hand on night shifts when questions slept. Each time the convoy reached the bend on time, the partnership tightened another notch. What nobody outside the chain saw in real time was how thoroughly bullion replaced budget lines. Taxes are debated, bars are weighed. Gold walked out in courier bags and came back as silence. Salaries paid in cash, fuel deliveries prepaid, favors banked. When US sanctions blacklisted Wagner-linked firms, the pit didn't pause. Shells rotated. The Africa Corps label slid over the old logo like a new sticker on a used truck. Planes still lifted. Invoices still cleared through middlemen. In Dubai, intake desks asked for origin and got an answer that would survive a casual audit. It was enough. Then came the copycats. If Ndassima could fund a war's quiet phase, why not other pits? Survey teams arrived where maps were more hopeful than real. Small airstrips sprouted scrub fences. A rumor spread that if you wore the right patch, every checkpoint saluted. In villages, men learned to recognize the difference between a soldier's boot and a contractor's boot by the way it landed on a doorway. The contractor asked about schedules. The soldier asked about rebels. One decided the time school let out. The other decided who could sleep at home. There's a cost to living on a timetable written in a mill house. Women hauling water shifted paths to avoid night trucks. Kids learned that the loudspeaker at the plant meant dinner might be late because their fathers' shifts moved again. Pastors shortened sermons when the siren wailed. A wedding paused because the convoy needed the road. This is how a mine rewires a country, not just in laws or budgets, but in the hours people breathe. At Ndassima, the hum of the crushers became the metronome. The minister's photo went on a wall. The monitors kept scrolling. And the road to the pit became a line of credit that never closed so long as the barrier kept lifting for the right cargo. Mali and Burkina Faso, juntas, contracts, and new concessions. 3 days after the second coup in Bamako, a colonel walked into a dim office where a mining file waited on a metal desk. The folder had 2 tabs, security cooperation and concession review. He didn't separate them. That's Mali's pivot in one gesture. Guns and ground folded into the same paperwork. Stakes first. The junta needed legitimacy, cash flow, and a force that could fight without nagging. Western trainers had gone home. Insurgents pressed along the gold belt that runs under villages whose names don't appear on maps, but whose soil pays salaries in Bamako. From their perspective, a partner who brings rotor blades, advisors, and deniable units looks like oxygen. The cost, access, preferably where the ground glitters. Action. Russian-linked teams arrived with the language of advisors and trainers, but their escorts rode routes that mattered economically. Meanwhile, mining deals started skipping tender boards, justified as strategic partnerships. In regions near Lulo and Fekola, companies with Russian capital or connections appeared in filings that journalists couldn't easily trace end to end. Soldiers secured corridors, survey crews followed, local administrators learned new signals, who to salute, when to keep the ledger open. A mayor in K's whispered to a friend, they don't ask for receipts, they ask for time windows. Impact. The junta stabilized the capital and showed televised convoys rolling under its flag. In gold country, the rhythm changed. Artisanal pits faced temporary suspensions that never lifted. Night movements increased. Contracts bought quiet around processing plants, and the Treasury's short-term oxygen came from advances tied to ounces not yet poured. The sovereignty question didn't vanish. It was deferred to a later season. Meanwhile, something else was happening in Ouagadougou. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped into power with a rifle on his shoulder and a message that landed well in mining towns. We'll take back what feeds strangers. The security crisis was brutal. Attacks near shafts, ambushes on haul roads, villages emptied overnight. But the gold didn't stop moving. It just moved under heavier guard. Stakes in Burkina Faso are brutal and simple. The state needs revenue to fight and to perform. Communities need protection that actually arrives. Foreign miners want stability, predictable permits, and lately, a government that won't cancel breakfast by lunch. Into that tangle, a new file slid across a minister's desk. Nordgold's industrial license for the new deposit. 52, 8 square kilometers, a projected contribution of over $89 million to the national budget over its life. On paper, a win. On the ground, a wedge. Action. The government began talking in two voices at once. One promised national refining, local beneficiation, and tighter control over exports. The other signed off on industrial projects that could bring heavy kit and jobs fast. In gold belts stretching from the central plateau toward the Sahel, soldiers took over roadblocks. A viral clip showed troops standing on the Jibbo Greenstone belt, declaring it secured. Off camera, fixers called buyers in the UAE to adjust schedules because escorts had new rules. Impact. Foreign headlines framed it as a gold revolution. In towns near future pits, the change felt more like a new landlord. Some artisanal crews were told to register for cooperatives. Others were pushed beyond perimeter stakes. Talk of a national refinery lit up radio shows. If Burkina pours its own bars, maybe the margin stays. But refining doesn't erase who guards the gate. If the army's presence unlocks concessions that trend toward foreign balance sheets, control feels performative unless communities see cash, clinics, and contracts that stick. Here's the hinge between Mali and Burkina. Both bet that sovereignty can be rebuilt while partnering with actors who prefer opacity. In Mali, the bet rides on Russian-linked security and the business shadow that follows. In Burkina, the bet rides on a nationalist message paired with selective openness to Russian miners and any investor willing to move under fire. In both, the timeline pressures every decision. Tomorrow's attack decides whether today's contract survives. A micro-story lands the risk. A Burkinabe foreman near New kept a ledger and pencil because ink felt too confident. One morning, soldiers told him to hold trucks for a sweep. At noon, a government envoy arrived with a camera crew to announce jobs. By evening, a man from a trading house called to confirm export windows through Ouagadougou had narrowed by 2 days. Why? The foreman asked. New procedures, the voice said. He sharpened his pencil and crossed out a week's plan with a straight line. Meanwhile, sanctions and scrutiny circled. Western diplomats warned of human rights risks and opaque licensing. Activists flagged disappearances around artisanal zones. Officials insisted on reform. Paperwork improved its manners, but bullion stayed pragmatic. Unregulated flows still found Dubai. Compliance teams learned to spell new company names. The pattern didn't break, it rebranded. The deeper cost hides in trust. If a junta's survival depends on ounces secured by partners who also hold concessions, what judge can rule against a mine? What auditor can slow a con? In Mali and Burkina Faso, gold isn't just revenue, it's the hinge on which power swings. And when power swings on metal, the men with guns decide whose hands touch the scales. Sudan's gold laundromat, Meroe gold, and the shadow roots. 3 days after Khartoum woke to gunfire in 2019, a small office on Africa Street opened early. The receptionist flipped a sign to closed, but kept letting men in, accountants with flash drives, a logistics fixer with a sat phone, and a security liaison who smelled like Jet A1. On the door, a modest plaque for a company few Sudanese could place on a map, Meroe Gold. Inside those flash drives lived a different kind of evacuation plan, not people, ounces. Stakes first. Sudan's gold isn't a sideshow, it's a lifeline. Oil money vanished after South Sudan's secession. The state needed hard currency. Generals needed payroll. Militias needed diesel and ammo. The countryside, Darfur, South Kordofan, the Red Sea Hills, was dotted with artisanal pits and a handful of industrial sites. Whoever controlled the flows controlled politics. For families at the pit face, a day's work meant millet or nothing. For the men in uniform, it meant leverage. For a set of foreign partners, it meant a revenue stream that could move when banks froze. Action unfolded in overlapping layers. Meroe Gold, part of a Russian-linked business web, embedded itself in Sudan's gold economy by offering processing capacity, technical assistance, and logistics in places where government oversight thinned to rumor. Their team set up buying desks that paid cash at pits starved of buyers, then funneled ore and concentrate into plants that shaved value at each step. Meanwhile, security relationships, formal and informal, kept trucks moving. Local commanders secured corridors in exchange for a cut, sometimes paid in cash, sometimes in kindness that would be redeemed later. A field manager in River Nile State kept 2 phones, one for geology, one for permissions that never saw a stamp. Meanwhile, something else was happening along the borders. Shadow routes fattened. From Darfur, gold moved west toward Chad and south to Car, where paperwork could be washed and reissued. From the Red Sea, couriers threaded wadis toward Port Sudan, swapping license plates before dawn. East, traders hugged roads to Kassala, then slipped across to Eritrea when the heat rose. The cleanest path, though, ran by air. Small consignments left airstrips near mining hubs, showed up in Khartoum with just enough paper, then hit flights to Dubai, where the intake desk didn't ask questions it didn't want answered. Impact arrived as numbers that didn't add up. Official export tallies limped. Domestic prices spiked. Yet Dubai refiners logged tonnages that implied Sudan was producing far more than the state admitted. Investigators later traced networks tied to Kremlin-linked actors moving over $1 billion worth of gold out of Sudan, laundering origin through middlemen and shell entities. On the ground, that meant salaries paid off-book to friendly units, spare parts for old helicopters, and favors banked with men the government couldn't fire. A micro-story makes the machinery human. In Atbara, a broker named Hassan weighed a sock full of concentrate on a kitchen scale while his brother watched the street. A buyer he'd never met offered a price above the market and a promise: pick up at midnight, no questions. Hassan took the deal. 2 days later, his cousin at the customs office texted a photo of a manifest with a different exporter's name and a shipment weight that didn't match the sock. "Be careful," the cousin wrote. "You're a spectator now." What nobody knew at the time, at least not in full, was how neatly the laundromat clicked into Sudan's new war economy after 2023. As army and rapid support forces split the capital into hostile grids, mining zones became piggy banks with rifles. Units aligned with whoever secured their district. In some towns, RSF men appeared at buying offices. In others, army intelligence took a seat near the scales. The gold still moved. It just changed escorts. Meroe's footprint didn't vanish. It adapted. New intermediaries, different license holders, the same routes. Sanctions tried to bite. The US Treasury listed Meroe gold and affiliates, signaling banks and traders to step back. A few did. Compliance teams flagged shipments. Some couriers paused. But bullion flows bend, they don't break. Shells spun up in new jurisdictions. Ownerships shuffled to cousins of cousins. In Dubai, intake desks updated checklists and logged the bars. If asked, an exporter could produce a folder thick with stamps from a provincial office that hadn't had electricity all week. Meanwhile, communities at the pits paid in blood and silence. In Jebel Aimer, gunfire decided who dug. In Jeddah, a father sold his motorbike to buy his son a spot on a crew that would be extorted twice before payday. In the Red Sea Hills, a convoy detoured around a village clinic because the shortcut saved an hour and the buyer's plane wouldn't wait. The laundromat wasn't just a financial machine. It was a map of who mattered and who didn't. Here's the hinge. In Sudan, the laundromat connects war to wallet without passing through a parliament. If a refinery receipt in Dubai can substitute for a budget in Khartoum, then the men who move metal outrank the men who write laws. That's why Meroe gold matters beyond any single shipment. It turns a resource into a private tax and then spends it on a conflict that guarantees the next load will also need an escort. The smuggling spine, from bush airstrips to Dubai refineries. Start at dusk when the heat drops and the radio's clear. A Toyota noses onto a laterite strip carved from scrub, headlights taped, beds stacked with olive ammo cans that don't carry ammo. Each can holds river-washed concentrate, zip-tied in grain sacks, double-bagged to mask the scent of chemicals. 2 men in mismatched uniforms step from the thorn line. One checks the plates, the other checks his watch. The plane is late. The mine doesn't care. The schedule does. Stakes first. This is the spine that keeps the whole body moving. Quiet airstrips, dirt roads, border cut-throughs, and couriers who know which checkpoint commander likes menthols. If a single leg breaks, cash dries. When cash dries, loyalties loosen. That's why the spine is layered. Redundancy is policy. If the strip is flooded, the convoy runs. If the road is hot, the bike courier takes the footpath with a saddlebag of stones and a letter from a colonel who never writes letters. Action starts small. Bags move from pickup to scale under tarp light. A fixer scribbles weights into a notebook with grease-blackened fingers. He isn't measuring purity, he's measuring risk. Each kilo is a promise made to a buyer who wired an advance through a cousin's company 2 borders away. A mechanic yanks a starter rope until the generator coughs. Blue light flickers. A prop spins. The pilot turns the plane with a boot and a curse, then waves the cans aboard. No manifest, just a handshake and a half sentence. Same place. Meanwhile, something else is happening 50 kilometers downriver. A second team walks ore in buckets to a canoe at a bend where reeds hide the bank. A woman who sells soap at the market counts the buckets aloud. Her cut is 2 cups per 10, tax paid to a micro-sovereign who controls the bend. The canoe pushes into current, skims a sandbar, and disappears under a canopy of bats that rise like smoke. 10 hours later, those buckets are drums on a flatbed, with a tarpaulin stamped with a logistics company's logo that has never owned a warehouse. The spine thickens in towns that smell like diesel and metal filings. In Kars Bambari, in Mali's Kays, in Sudan's Atbara, buying houses sit behind steel gates painted a tired blue. Signs promise technical services. Inside, a back room hosts a bullion scale and 2 cups of tea that never go cold. A broker arrives with a sack and a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. The clerk scrapes a sample, whispers a number, and unlocks a drawer of crisp bills. Nobody says Dubai. Everyone means Dubai. Impact lands in ledgers you'll never see. At an airport office with a broken air con, a clerk stamps export papers for semi-processed ore bound for a trading firm in a neighboring capital. The weight looks plausible, the origin looks clean, and the fee, paid in cash at lunch, looks like the reason the stamp falls straight. The bag that flies carries a different weight than the paper. By the time it hits a Gulf intake desk, the name on the exporter has changed twice, and the origin story has been smoothed like a river stone. Micro story. A courier named Amadou wears the same grey cap on every run because he believes luck lives in cloth. He boards a flight with 2 carry-ons that a security officer waves through after a whispered call. In Dubai, a man he knows only as Yuma meets him before immigration with a smile and a badge he never shows twice. Amadou hands over the bags, gets an envelope, and a room key for 6 hours of sleep. When he wakes, the phone is gone from the nightstand. He checks the envelope. The stack is perfect. He doesn't count the favors he now owes. What nobody outside the floor sees is the arithmetic that turns geology into liquidity. At the refinery, intake asks 3 questions it already knows how to survive. Who, where, how pure. A stack of documents proves a journey through a country with better paperwork than the one where the gold was dug. Compliance clicks boxes. A sample melts. A bar cools with a new birth certificate. On a spreadsheet linked to accounts that wire like water, the story is now a commodity. Sanctions nibble at the edges. A company name goes dark. A bank freezes a transfer. A trader gets skittish. Therefore, shells rotate. A sister's LLC takes the license. A nephew signs as director. The domain changes from .cm to .bz. The phone number doesn't. The spine bends and reroutes. Bush strips shift to night slots. Convoys wait for fog. On the radio, a new call sign lives where the old one died. Meanwhile, communities along the spine pay in stray bullets and missed markets. A midwife in a roadside village stops a delivery because a convoy throttles past and dust chokes the clinic's single fan. A teacher dismisses class early because the plane's approach pattern crosses the schoolyard and the kids cover their ears and forget their sums. A shopkeeper stocks batteries because the tarps hide weigh scales that need light when the grid fails. They don't see Dubai. They hear it in the distance every night. Here's the hinge. The smuggling spine isn't an accident, it's infrastructure. It stitches together pits, checkpoints, and refineries into a single nervous system with money as its signal. Break one node, it reroutes. Cut 2, it regrows. As long as a bar can be reborn with clean paperwork and a quiet stamp, the spine will keep carrying the weight of wars sold as contracts and contracts sold as stability. People in the blast radius, miners, communities, and survival. Start with a miner's hands. Call him Jean-Baptiste. He worked Ndassima before the fences, calloused palms, a plastic vial on a string, a day measured in handfuls of gravel and hope. When the concession hardened, he stood at a new gate while a guard told him there was work inside at half the money and triple the rules. He took it because Rice doesn't care about politics. 2 months later, a blast curtain shut on his shift, and the supervisor said, "Security incident, no pay for the day." His wife, Clarice, sells cassava near the bend where convoys idle. She times her pots to the engine rumble. If trucks run late, she burns stock and loses profit. If they arrive early, soldiers clear the roadside and her table goes cold behind a tape line. She used to trade with artisanal diggers who tipped her in dust and coins. Now, dust travels in bags under tarps, and coins come in lump, sums from men who never give their names twice. Meanwhile, something else is happening in towns that don't appear on maps. In Kars Bambari, a clinic tracks injuries that rhyme with extraction, crushed fingers, gas burns, gunshot wounds that arrive with stories nobody repeats. A nurse keeps a notebook with first names and a column for incident location that she fills with euphemisms. The hill, the fence, the road. She learned to stop writing mine after a plainclothes visitor borrowed the notebook and didn't bring it back. In Mali's case, a cooperative of artisanal miners tried to formalize. They printed membership cards, drafted safety rules, and asked for recognition. The answer was a temporary suspension, stamped by a distant office and enforced by men who arrived at dawn. Picks were seized. A foreman was beaten with the handle of his own shovel. The cooperative president fled to Bamako and now sells phone credit under a beach umbrella he never meant to own. He keeps the stamp from their application in his pocket like a relic. South of the border, in Burkina Faso Sahel fringe, a teacher named Awad draws a map on a blackboard with 3 lines. The road, the river, the pit. "We don't cross the road when the convoy comes," she tells her class. The children know the drill. They press against the mud wall when engines growl, hands over ears, faces chalky with dust. After the trucks pass, Awad restarts her lesson and watches 2 students slump asleep because their fathers worked a night shift the mine called at the last minute. Stakes are intimate. When the pit expands, the cemetery edge moves. In one village near an industrial site, graves were flagged with bright tape and the elders told to relocate ancestors. Compensation came as a single meeting and a figure that translated into 3 goats and a month of rice. The elders nodded in public and wept in private. A week later, a bulldozer idled at the boundary while a priest read a prayer that coughed under diesel. Action twists daily routines into workarounds. Market women reroute footpaths to avoid new checkpoints that ask more questions of women than men. Young men hire themselves out as night guides, human GPS for convoys that don't want to use headlights. A local mechanic makes a living welding tailgates and silencers for vehicles that carry more than tarpaulins. On Sundays, the pastor shortens the service to the length of a blast cycle and calls it Providence. The choir knows it's the mill's schedule. Impact arrives as quiet math. In households pushed off artisanal claims, income halves and debts double. Girls leave school first. Boys follow to dig elsewhere with strangers. Food prices tick up because trucks that once hauled yams now haul drums. The clinic's vaccine fridge goes warm when the generator diesel is diverted to the plant. In a month when the mine meets its target, the town's water pump fails from overuse, and nobody fixes it because the spare parts budget was reallocated. Micro story. In a car village, a boy named Marcel sells phone cards outside the new security post. He recognizes patches: National Army, Presidential Guard, the foreign unit with no flag. One afternoon, he watches a miner argue for back pay, hears a thud behind the gate, and later sees the man's wife walking home alone, carrying a pair of boots. Marcel stops selling for 2 days. When he returns, he charges extra for SIM top-ups and starts hiding his cash in a crack under the kiosk where even soldiers don't look. What nobody in the capital feels is the fear that teaches silence. In Sudan's Atbara, a broker's wife hangs laundry and pauses when a new pickup idles on their street. She counts heartbeats until the engine shuts off somewhere else. In Mali, a griot refuses to sing praise for a local administrator who who signed a concession map. His song that night is a lament for rivers turned to slurry. In Burkina, a mother ties a bright cloth around her son's wrist so she can see him when the convoy dusk turns noon into dusk. There's resilience, but it's costly. Women form tontines to cover hospital fees when paydays slip. Youth groups organize night watches that report gunfire with coded whistles. A town near Ndassima builds a footbridge to cut 10 minutes off the walk to a well after the old path became restricted. They paint the railing blue. A week later, a guard leans on it, lights a cigarette, and says, "Nice bridge." The village headman nods and asks if the company might help with a clinic roof. The guard shrugs. The bridge holds. Here's the hinge. Survival becomes a choreography around someone else's schedule. If your life moves to the metronome of crushes and call signs, you learn to dance or you sit in the dark. Either way, you're paying for a calculus written in ounces you'll never touch. South Africa's Zama War, when the state loses the shaft. While that was unfolding across the Sahel and the Car, another front rumbled beneath South Africa's feet. Less about concessions on paper, more about vacuum and hunger. When formal mining retreated, it didn't leave empty tunnels. It left an economy without a landlord. 6,000 disused shafts became doorways. 30,000 men, many undocumented, many desperate, stepped through and found a war that pays in dust. Stakes are immediate. In Gauteng townships and Free State hamlets, rent, school fees and remittances ride on a few grams scraped at midnight. For the state, each ounce lost is revenue bled from a sector that once bankrolled the country. For syndicates, the abandoned labyrinth is a balance sheet protected by fear. And for communities above, the ground is a drum rolling with echoes. Blasts at 2 a.m., gunfire in the afternoon, sirens that never reach the deepest drift. Action in this war is a shift change nobody announces. At sunset, look down a fenced-off headgear, ropes creak, homemade winches squeal, and men with battery lamps disappear into air older than their grandparents. They carry bread loaf explosives, copper wire, cheap respirators, and the promise of a buyer waiting by dawn. Underground, rival crews mark territory with spray paint and threats. A wrong turn isn't just a misstep, it's walking into a tax. Pay or bleed, sometimes both. Meanwhile, something else is happening topside. Syndicates stack the logistics, diesel, mercury again, extorted protection, and a chain of buyers that ends in city workshops where illicit ore is smelted into the anonymity of a wedding band. Women from Lesotho and Zimbabwe sell food at the shaft edge, their stalls built from pallets and hope. Kids learn the vocabulary early: level, reef, blast, sweep. A pastor kneels on asphalt, praying for a rescue when the earth coughs, and a tunnel seals 20 men into air that runs out between radio calls. The violence isn't random, it's governance by cartridge. Shootouts crack between rival groups in stoped chambers lit by headlamps and curses. Above ground, turf fights trail into taxi ranks and shebeens. In late 2024, hundreds were trapped at Stilfontein, an underground standoff that pulled sirens, TV cameras, and soldiers to a mine the economy had already forgotten. Police arrested over 1,000 people across operations, some of them kids, some of them men who'd spent weeks breathing dust and counting breaths. Impact lands in quiet numbers that don't fit an annual report. South Africa loses an estimated 25 tons of gold a year to illegal mining, money that never sees a tax stamp, never funds a clinic, never fixes the pothole the ambulance hits on the way to a collapse. The formal mining houses harden perimeters, weld plates over portals, flood shafts. Each fix expensive, each fix a dare. Close one tunnel, 3 new entrances bloom through backyards and factory floors. Operation Vala Umgodi rolls out late 2024. Raids, confiscations, fences, deployments. The syndicates bend, then reset. A micro story. A Zama named Thabo sits on a crate cleaning a home-built pistol with engine oil. He left Gweru after the rains failed, and the job at the mill went to a cousin of a councillor. Down the shaft near Springs, his crew works a thin reef and sleeps in a chamber where the roof flakes with a soft tick that sounds like a clock. He sends cash home through a runner who takes a fee that hurts. When police sweep the settlement, Thabo's blanket and a pair of boots disappear. He buys a new blanket from the same officer's cousin 2 days later. What nobody outside the belt hears is the economy that grows around the void. Night taxis run, miners, routes for cash only. Welders make gates that close with a kick and locks that surrender to the right bribe. Corner shops stock headlamps, pick handles, and paracetamol next to candles and mealy meal. A mortuary attendant learns to read lungs by the color of dust. A school principal times assemblies to avoid blasting windows when underground charges ripple the ground and make children scream. Meanwhile, the state plays whack-a-mole with ghosts. Border posts catch smugglers with mercury and dynamite. A judge releases them on a technicality the syndicate's lawyer learned 3 cases ago. Politicians promise mine rehabilitation and new livelihoods. Budgets arrive late and thin. The shafts wait. In a council office, a map with red pins spreads like a rash. Here's the hinge. This isn't the Wagner model or the EO template. It's the same physics with different actors. When the state steps back and value sits unguarded, someone writes rules with a gun. The Zama war is resource conflict stripped of paperwork, the raw edge of security for wealth without the veneer of permits. The consequence rhymes with every other front in this story. A resource becomes a currency. A gun becomes a stamp. And people at the edge learn to count by the sound of detonators. The politics of dependency. Security now, sovereignty later. The pitch always lands in a moment of fear. A convoy was ambushed last week. A mayor got a death threat, perils late. A president stares at a map that bleeds at the edges and picks the option that keeps the capital quiet by Friday. Security now. The promise is that sovereignty can be rebuilt once the smoke clears. But every month the arrangement holds, the center of gravity shifts a few inches away from the flag. Start with the trade nobody advertises. A foreign partner supplies trainers, bodyguards, rotor blades, and a narrative on local radio that makes the palace sound invincible. In exchange, ministries sign permits that outlast ministers. Concessions extend. Export quotas bend. Offtake agreements are pegged to production targets that become sacred. The partners' men secure roads, escort fuel, decide when a town sleeps. On paper, the state is sovereign. In practice, the checkpoint answers to a radio you don't control. Meanwhile, something else is happening in the budget. Hard currency starts showing up off calendar. Advances arrive in cash through intermediaries tied to the same network that guards the mine. Diesel deliveries are prepaid. Salaries get covered by envelopes, not appropriations. A finance director who once argued for audits finds she's chasing shipments, not numbers. Try to slow a convoy, and your security detail asks if you're sure. Try to pause a permit, and a colonel calls to clarify priorities. Stakes are personal for leaders who survived coups or nearly lost wars. They read stability as survival. If the city is calm and the airport is open, they can govern tomorrow. The long term becomes a story for later. They tell themselves they'll renegotiate once things stabilize, but stability becomes the justification for renewing the deal. The longer the partner is embedded, the more painful the break. It's a ratchet, one click at a time. Action looks like policy by convenience. Procurement rules get streamlined for security-relevant projects. Oversight boards skip meetings for safety. A parliament debates a mining code revision, while enforcement slowly migrates to a joint liaison office that sits inside a partner's compound. A new tax on artisanal miners is announced to formalize the sector, and the first collection point opens next to a gate guarded by men with no insignia. Temporary checkpoints become permanent concrete. A mayor finds his seat moved further from decisions and his microphone turned down. Impact shows up in the places that can't say no. A judge who rules against a company tied to the security network finds his bodyguards reassigned. A journalist asking about export discrepancies is invited to discuss her tone and then followed home by an unmarked pickup. A village headman who resists relocation gets a visit from community engagement staff with maps that don't have room for graph. The state's ability to arbitrate shrinks. Sovereignty isn't a speech. It's the power to delay, deny, and decide. When those verbs move outside the Constitution, sovereignty moves with them. Micro-story. A minister promises a clinic to a town on a haul road. He gets applause and a photo, Weeks pass. The company's liaison hands him a schedule, blast cycles, convoy windows, production targets. The clinic is penciled for after Q3, contingent on security. The minister nods because he needs the trucks to keep rolling. The clinic becomes a hostage to the mill's calendar. He isn't captured by bribes, he's captured by dependence. What nobody admits in the room is the quiet logic that organizes the whole arrangement. Once your peril depends on ounces guarded by the same people who hold the gate, you've traded pieces of your veto for tonight's calm. You can still fire a minister. You can't fire the men who keep the road open without risking the road. You can still pass a law. You can't enforce it where the concessions perimeter glows under floodlights and the radio crackles in a language your officers don't speak. Sanctions try to break the spell. A treasury designation lands, a bank freezes a transfer, a press release scolds. Therefore, names change, licenses migrate to straw owners, and the partnership reappears with a new logo. The government tells donors it's in control. The donors want to believe it. The mine hums. The convoys move. The dependency deepens because the alternative is chaos by morning. There's a counter-argument in every cabinet. We're using them, not the other way around. Maybe, but the balance sheet says otherwise. If bullion is underwriting security outside the budget, and security is underwriting policy outside debate, sovereignty is being paid in installments you won't get back. The politics of dependency isn't a collapse. It's a glide path. You don't notice the descent until the runway lights you see aren't yours. Sanctions, exposure, and the cat-and-mouse economy. Exposure usually starts with a name on a PDF. Lobe Invest, Meroe Gold, a registrar's address, a director whose signature looks practiced. Then a press conference in Washington or Brussels, designations announced, assets frozen, warnings issued to banks and traders. Cameras flash, compliance teams take notes, someone drafts a memo titled Enhanced Due Diligence. On the ground, a gate guard shrugs, flips a badge, and keeps waving trucks through. Stakes come fast after exposure. If a company is blacklisted, cash gets sticky. Wire transfers stall, insurance evaporates, suppliers hesitate. That's when the cat-and-mouse begins. The network can't let the mine stop or the convoy miss its window. Miss a week and salaries slip, fuel dries, loyalties wobble. The answer is agility in the grey. Reincorporate, rename, rotate directors. Shift licenses to nominees with clean passports. Keep the radio call signs, change the letterhead. Action looks like paperwork gymnastics paired with field discipline. A sanctioned entity shutters on Monday. By Friday, a fresh company with a near-identical scope appears in the Gazette. The director is a cousin of a cousin. The beneficial owner sits behind a chain that ends in a mailbox in the Indian Ocean. The liaison who used to sign community engagement now signs procurement. At the pit, the same foreman reads a new safety poster with the logo swapped. He doesn't care what the company is called. He cares whether the diesel Bowser arrives before the mill chokes. Meanwhile, something else is happening in the trade corridors. Middlemen adjust itineraries like pilots adjusting for crosswinds. If Khartoum is too hot, reroute through N'Djamena. If Bamako's paperwork draws attention, pivot to Conakry with a story about artisanal consignments consolidated for export. In the Gulf, a refiner updates its intake policy, adds a line about country of origin risk, and opens an account for a supplier that swears by new compliance protocols. A sample melts, a bar cools, a certificate prints. Boxes tick, ounces move. The impact of sanctions shows up in margins and methods, not in miracles. Premiums rise to compensate for risk. Couriers charge more for quiet. Compliance departments at banks ask for proof of provenance. Exporters present a stack of stamps from a provincial office whose stamp pad dried out months ago. Some shipments get stuck. Others slide through with timing and the right phone call. The economy learns to breathe through a narrower straw. Micro-story. A buyer in Bangui named Pierre keeps 3 SIM cards taped under his desk. After a US designation hits a Wagner-linked firm, his main contact sends a new number with a single word. Continue. Pierre checks his safe. Stacks of CFA, dollars, dirhams, then texts a code to confirm a pickup at dusk. When a knock comes, the courier hands over the same canvas bag he's brought for months, except the tag now reads a new company name. Peer counts quickly, smells the faint almond of cyanide on the cloth, and files the receipt in a folder labeled Clients. See, the old folder labeled L is sealed with tape. What nobody sees on a press podium is the adaptation cycle. It moves in weeks, not years. Designation, rebrand, reroute, reprice, repeat. Each turn makes the network leaner, more selective, and more dependent on trusted nodes. That's why exposure can paradoxically harden the core. The careless intermediaries fall away, the careful ones get richer. The operators who relied on open accounts shift to cash, barter, and hawala. An invoice becomes a whisper between men who have watched each other's backs at a checkpoint at 2 a.m. Meanwhile, investigators refine their own playbook. Satellite images track pads expanding, trade data flags anomalies between declared African exports and Gulf imports. Interviews from displaced miners sketch the human cost behind every uptick. Reports land with footnotes and maps. Names connect across countries like pins on a corkboard. The public learns phrases: security for resources, illicit financial flows, beneficial ownership, while the people at the pit learn new uniform patches and the hours to stay indoors. Here's where the cat and mouse gets personal. A compliance officer in Dubai rejects a lot with a dubious origin certificate. The supplier calls, apologizes, and returns a week later with better paper and a stronger story. The lot passes. That officer sleeps fine because the forms align. A week later, a clinic in Bambari runs out of antibiotics. The truck that would have brought them waited an extra day at a checkpoint because the convoy carrying ore had priority. Sanctions didn't cause that delay. The system they're chasing did. But the pressure adds friction in the one place that never pays it, the town at the bend. A second micro-story lands in a Johannesburg suburb. A small refinery gets a visit from inspectors after a TV piece on illegal gold. The owner produces logs, supplier IDs, and photos of smiling miners in hard hats, stock images from a brochure. He points to a compliance certificate on the wall. The inspectors check boxes, note areas for improvement, and leave. In the back room, a technician watches a bead of molten metal quiver, then fall into a mold. He stamps it, wipes his forehead, and lowers the radio when a voice mentions a surname he's learned not to repeat. Sanctions aren't useless, they're slow knives. They raise costs, shorten supply lines, and force mistakes. A sloppy alias, a reused IP, a bank account that stays open one day too long. That's how investigators catch threads. But the cat has 9 lives because the house is dark. States in crisis can't or won't light every room. So the mouse learns the floorboards, moves at night, and bets that morning will bring another name on a PDF and another day at the mill. Here's the hinge. Exposure hurts reputations. Sanctions pinch margins. Neither alone resets the bargain. As long as bullion can be reborn with clean paperwork and the men with guns keep the road open, the economy of evasion remains a business model, not a glitch. The cat keeps swiping. The mouse keeps running. And somewhere far from any podium, a guard at a gate flips a badge to a new logo and says, "Same rules." Echoes of EO. What worked, what broke, what repeats. Here's the through line that keeps circling back. Speed plus skill retakes revenue ground. EO proved it in Angola and Sierra Leone. Small, disciplined units with air and logistics can flip the map fast enough to shock a treasury back to life. That part worked. It worked so well that presidents started seeing combat power as a line item with payback periods, not a ministry's monopoly. The echo is loud in Bamako, Bangui, Khartoum, and Ouagadougou. The playbook repeats because the incentive structure repeats. What also worked was the optics of control. EO's presence let governments claim initiative after years of retreat. That aura matters. It buys negotiating space, election windows, donor meetings that don't start with scolding. Wagner's turn in car hit the same nerve. The palace was safe, roads reopened, markets buzzed. Stability, visible, televisable, became the product, and mines were the subscription that paid for it. The repeat isn't accidental, it's the sales pitch perfected. But the breakpoints were baked in from day one. EO shortened wars without repairing states. Fast wins didn't fix command discipline, logistics cultures, or courts. When EO left, old pathologies rushed back because nothing structural had changed beyond who held the hill. That's the first fracture line. In Ka, the parallel state filled that same gap, except instead of a vacuum, it left a competing gravity well that pulled ministries toward the mine gate. The pattern repeats: tactical success, strategic dependency. Another thing that broke is legitimacy management. EO operated with tacit political cover until international pressure spiked. Legitimacy wobbled and contracts collapsed. Today's networks preempt that by operating behind shells, deniable affiliates, and local nominees. They survive the legitimacy hit by diffusing it. Yet the pressure still extracts a cost. Rebranding cycles, higher risk premiums, more violence pushed outward to shield the core. Every sanction adds friction the pit won't pay. Towns along the spine do. EO also set a habit around formalization that curdled over time. Clearing rebels often cleared artisanal miners. Safety was the reason on paper, but the effect concentrated value at the concession. Now the repetition is harder. In Mali and Burkina Faso, temporary suspensions lock out cooperatives for good. In Ka, security operations around Ndassima harden into standing exclusions. The tool EO used to stabilize fronts becomes a lever to privatize access. The vocabulary didn't change, the intent slid. What repeats most dangerously is the budget logic. EO demonstrated that securing revenue nodes funds the fight. Wagner and successors weaponized the loop. Bullion off-book pays for the paramilitaries who guard the bullion. Sudan's laundromat turned that into muscle memory. A convoy today, a refinery intake tomorrow, a commander's peril tonight. Sanctions slow the flow, but don't reroute the logic. The bar keeps being reborn with papers that pass a desk that needs the fee. There's a governance rhyme too. EO's footprint, though controversial, still nested alongside state forces, and for a time pointed back to a ceasefire track. The echo today is a misread. Leaders think they're buying time to rebuild institutions. Instead, institutions learn to orbit a private perimeter. Judges blink, auditors detour, mayors wait outside gates for envelopes labeled community. Once authority is rerouted through a liaison's phone, the Constitution becomes a suggestion with patriotic branding. Human consequences repeat with grim fidelity. EO's campaigns pushed violence down by pushing capacity up. For many civilians, that meant fewer massacres in the short term. But when the model shifts from battlefield to balance sheet, the pain moves into daily life. The school that times recess to blast cycles. The clinic that goes warm when diesel is diverted. The family priced out when a road becomes a hall corridor. The faces change. Jean-Baptiste at Ndassima, Wagner New, Hassan in at Bara, but the bargain lands on their tables. What didn't repeat was accountability. EO answered to a corporate center that could be pressured, sued, or shamed. It had a public figurehead and a brand susceptible to headlines. The newer networks learned from that vulnerability. They fragment, rename, reincorporate. Try suing a PO box. Try shaming a logo that vanishes by Monday. The echo here is anti-sound. Silence where a public interlocutor should be. Fog where oversight should focus. There's a final echo that sounds like inevitability and isn't. EO's lesson about speed can coexist with lawful, transparent security reform. Train national units, ring-fence revenues, publish contracts, protect artisanal livelihoods. Some African ministries are trying versions of that, pairing national refining plans with governance upgrades. But reform needs breathing room. When the metronome of the mill sets the day, reformers go hoarse talking over machinery. So what repeats? The temptation to outsource sovereign risk to men with ready radios. What breaks? The muscle of institutions that should outlast any contract. What worked? Speed on the battlefield. What failed? Patience in the State House. Until that balance flips, security that strengthens institutions instead of renting them, the echo of EO will keep bouncing through new names, new pits, and the same old perimeter rules. Endgame scenarios. 3 paths from here. Here's the question that keeps every finance minister, field commander, and village elder awake. How does this end? Not the contract, the model. 3 paths stand out, each costly, each possible, and each already visible in fragments on the ground. Path 1. institutional hardening with sunlight. Think of it as slow surgery while the patient is walking. The state keeps some private muscle in the short term, but cages it with law and light. Security contracts published. Concessions audited against export data and satellite imagery of pads and pits. Beneficial owners disclosed, not just a nominee's name, but the chain to the real decision maker. Gold exported only via licensed aggregators that tag lots at the pit with digital seals that survive every swap. Refineries in the Gulf agree to a higher standard. No intake from high-risk zones without mine-level traceability. Artisanal miners get legal space. Mapped zones, cooperative charters, fixed purchase floors so predatory buyers can't starve them out. Revenues ring-fenced to a sovereign account with citizens watching a dashboard in real time. Schools built, clinics stocked, roads paved. Judges and auditors protected by statute, and bluntly, by guards who answer to the flag, not a liaison's phone. It's not romantic, it's incremental and boring. But boring is the point. Each month that cash moves through budgets instead of courier bags, dependency loosens a notch. Countries like Ghana, and increasingly, parts of Tanzania have walked versions of this in other minerals, proof that resource sectors can be domesticated without smothering investment. The risk is political pain, exposing who benefited under the old rules, losing the speed of deniable funds, and angering partners who prefer fog. The gain is sovereignty that breathes on its own. Path 2, the sovereign pivot with new patrons. Same play, different jersey. Juntas and fragile presidencies swap one set of private soldiers and financiers for another, call it a multipolar hedge. Chinese firms take a pit, Turkish trainers a barracks, Emirati money a refinery, Russian units a corridor. On paper, diversification. In practice, a kaleidoscope of obligations that still routes veto power through gates you don't control. Contracts remain sealed. Artisanal zones shrink. The smuggling spine bends but doesn't break. It just picks different on ramps and flags. The Treasury gets cash advances, the palace gets a longer runway, and the public gets a rebranded version of the same bargain. Stability now, sovereignty later. The upside is short-term resilience against any single sanctioning power. The downside is deeper complexity. More veto points outside Parliament, more narratives flooding local radio, more confusion over who the law actually is. If the parallel states multiply, ministries become switchboards, not centers of gravity. Reformers burn out yelling into a storm of logos. Path 3, fracture and vacuum. The deal snaps through a scandal, a battlefield upset, a donor pullout, or an internal split among the private operators. The payroll misses, convoys stall, checkpoints freelance. Pits go dark in bursts and flare with gunfire at night. In Car, that looks like rebel splinters testing perimeters. In Mali, corridors contested by jihadi factions and self-defense militias squeezing both juntas and their partners. In Sudan, the laundromat turning into a civil war ATM with no cashier, gold trapped in districts that change hands weekly. Communities fall back on survival math. Shut the school, stockpile staples, sell livestock early, flee when the engine noise shifts. This path feels righteous to purists, tear off the parasite. But vacuums don't stay empty. They fill with whoever shoots straighter and pays faster. Illegal economies mature in the open. South Africa's Zama world is the cautionary tale. Once the landlord leaves, the shafts pick their own kings. So which path wins? None, cleanly. Hybrids are more likely. A capital might harden institutions around one flagship mine or bartering security at the fringes. A refiner might tighten intake on paper while expanding capacity off-site for artisanals. A junta might preach sovereignty while mortgaging it in ounces to cover next quarter's quiet. That's the uncomfortable truth. Endings arrive as accumulations, not events. Still, choices matter. If a government sets a bright line, no guns inside governance, then every contract that crosses it becomes a live wire. If refineries require mine-level traceability, the smuggling spine loses vertebrae. If artisanal miners are recognized as citizens with economic rights, security operations can't quietly erase livelihoods. And if citizens can see where the gold money goes, by week, not fiscal year, the politics of dependency starts to wobble under daylight. A last micro-story points forward. In a town near Ndassima, the council posted a notice. The clinic's generator fund will be updated every Friday on a chalkboard: donations, disbursements, receipts. The board sat under a tin awning. Men with radios walked by. No one tore it down. The first week, the total was small. The second, a trader added a stack. The third, the company liaison wrote a number and signed it. The chalk squeaked. It sounded like a hinge moving. Resolution and meaning. This isn't about gold. It's about who gets to decide when a nation sleeps and wakes. If you want the next chapter, the reformers, the refineries, and the fight to pry power from private gates, watch the story we've linked on the Sahel's new resource rules. Subscribe to follow the money, the myths, and the people who live between them.